The cold November air nipped at my face as I adjusted the straps of my pack. Harper walked a few steps ahead, her auburn hair catching the morning sunlight as she glanced over her shoulder to smile at me. The weight of the ring box deep in my pack felt heavier than it should have, but the thought of the moment ahead, the overlook, her face, the question, kept me moving. It had been 5 years since we first met on the Pacific Crest Trail, two strangers caught in a sudden snowstorm. She had saved me then, shared her emergency bivvy, rationed her food, and talked me through the night as the storm raged. I moved across the country for her after that hike, and I never regretted it. Now, we were celebrating that anniversary with another hike, this time on the Appalachian Trail. We'd carved out a full month for this trip, a miracle considering our jobs. Harper had negotiated time off from her veterinary clinic, and I had arranged my projects at the analytics firm to manage remote work if needed. A month wasn't long in the grand scheme of things, but for us, it was everything. We were already 2 weeks in, and the trail started out beautifully. Early November had draped the mountains in fiery reds and deep golds, and each step felt like walking through a painting. The mornings were chilly, but the sun warmed the afternoons just enough to keep the frost at bay. We fell into an easy rhythm, joking, sharing dreams for our future, and savoring the solitude of the trail. We made camp that night and fell asleep in each other's arms to the calming sounds of the Appalachian wilderness. The next morning, the air was crisp, and a thin veil of mist clung to the trees as Harper and I set out on the trail. The solitude of the Appalachian woods had settled in, a quiet rhythm that made each day blend into the next. As we rounded a bend, the muffled crunch of hurried footsteps broke the stillness. Coming toward us was an older couple, moving quickly and awkwardly down the trail. Their clothes were rumpled, their packs sagging unevenly, and both had the wild-eyed look of people who hadn't slept well in days. "Morning," I said, stepping aside to give them room. The man gave a stiff nod, his expression hard and unreadable, while the woman hesitated, her gaze darting between the trees like she expected something to leap out at them. "Hi," Harper added, her voice warm but cautious. The man slowed slightly, his grip tightening on the strap of his pack. "Morning," he replied gruffly. The woman, smaller and wiry with gray streaks in her pulled-back hair, looked at him as if waiting for permission. When he didn't say more, she adjusted her pack and offered us a nervous smile. "I'm Declan," I said, sensing the tension but trying to break it. I extended a hand. "This is Harper." The woman hesitated for a moment before shaking my hand briefly. "Annie," she said softly. She gestured toward the man. "This is John." John didn't offer his hand. Instead, he glanced back the way they'd come, his body language screaming impatience. "Where are you headed?" Harper asked, trying to keep the conversation light. John answered for them. "Back to our car." Harper raised an eyebrow. "How long have you been out here?" John's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Annie spoke up. "We've been out for 3.5 weeks, she said, her voice thin and tired. "We planned for 2 months, but—" John shot her a sharp look. "Plans change," he said curtly, cutting her off. Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. I glanced at Harper, who was watching them with the same cautious curiosity I felt. "Did something happen?" I asked carefully. "No," John said quickly, his tone a little too firm. "We just decided to head back. That's all." Annie shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking to the woods again. "It's better to be safe," she murmured, almost to herself. John stepped closer to her, his voice low and tight. "Annie, that's enough." The tension between them was palpable. Harper and I exchanged a glance, neither of us sure what to say. A distant hoot of an owl broke the silence, its eerie call echoing through the trees. Annie flinched, her head snapping toward the sound. "We should go," John said immediately, adjusting his pack. Annie hesitated, looking at me and Harper with something close to regret. You should, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Annie, John barked, his tone sharp enough to make her stop mid-sentence. She closed her mouth, her lips pressing into a thin line. Without another word, she hoisted her pack and followed John down the trail. As they disappeared around the bend, Annie glanced back over her shoulder. Her eyes met Harper's for a brief moment, and though she didn't say anything, her expression spoke volumes. What do you think that was about? Harper asked once they were out of sight. I don't know, I admitted, though unease coiled in my chest. But whatever it was, it's not our problem. Harper frowned but didn't argue. They seemed scared, she said softly. Maybe, I said, adjusting my pack. But people have all kinds of reasons for cutting a hike short. Let's just keep moving. We fell into a quiet pace, but the encounter lingered like a shadow. I reminded Harper that a tough hike can sometimes push people to their limits, making them act a little off. We both hoped that was all it was. The trail had been eerily quiet for hours, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves overhead and the steady crunch of our boots on the dirt path. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled light on the trail ahead. Harper stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. Declan, look, she said, pointing ahead. Nestled just off the trail was a campsite. At first glance, it looked normal. An orange tent pitched neatly in a small clearing, its nylon fabric taut and pristine. But as we got closer, the details started to feel wrong. Scattered around the tent were belongings: an overturned camping chair, a half-empty propane canister, and a backpack with its contents spilled out like someone had been rifling through it in a hurry. A pair of hiking boots lay abandoned near the smoldering remnants of a fire pit, one boot upright, the other toppled over. Hello? I called out, scanning the area. No one answered. The forest around us felt unnaturally still, as though the woods were holding their breath. Do you think someone's hurt? Harper asked, stepping cautiously closer to the campsite. Maybe, I said, though I wasn't sure. Or maybe they just packed up in a hurry and forgot some things. Harper crouched near the scattered supplies, picking up a water bottle that had rolled into the dirt. It was full. Why would someone leave this behind? She asked. Good question, I murmured. I moved toward the tent and unzipped the flap slowly, half expecting someone to yell at me to get out. But the interior was empty, tidy even. A sleeping bag lay unrolled on a sleeping pad, and a small camping lantern sat upright next to it, its bulb unlit. This is weird, Harper said, standing beside me now. If they were leaving in a hurry, wouldn't they have at least taken the tent? I nodded, unease prickling at the back of my neck. Yeah, and their boots. We stepped back from the tent, looking around the clearing. The scattered supplies suggested chaos, but there were no signs of what might have caused it. No footprints in the soft dirt, no broken branches or disturbed ground. Do you think animals got into their stuff? Harper asked, her voice quieter now. Maybe, I said, though I didn't believe it. Animals didn't usually scatter things like this without ripping them apart or leaving obvious claw marks. And the tent was untouched, its seams unbroken, its zippers undisturbed. Harper crouched near the fire pit, running her fingers over the edges of the blackened stones. This was recent, she said. The ashes are still warm. I looked at her, my stomach twisting. How recent? She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. A few hours, maybe less. We both turned back toward the trail, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The silence pressed in on us, heavy and suffocating. We should keep moving, I said finally, my voice low. If someone's out here, they might not want company. Harper hesitated, her eyes lingering on the scattered belongings. You think something scared them off? I didn't answer. Instead, I adjusted my pack and started back toward the trail. "Declan," Harper said, her voice sharp enough to stop me. I turned to see her holding something up, a notebook, its cover torn and smeared with dirt. "This was under the chair," she said, flipping it open. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, messy but legible. Most of it seemed to be ordinary notes about the trail, distances, landmarks, sketches of plants. But as she flipped through, the tone shifted. The writing became frantic, the sentences incomplete. "Harper," I said quietly. She stopped on one of the last pages, her face pale. "Listen to this," she said, her voice trembling. She read aloud. "They're watching. The night is dangerous. We're leaving tomorrow. We have to..." The sentence ended abruptly, the pen stroke trailing off the edge of the page. A chill ran down my spine. "Put that down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Harper looked at me, her eyes wide. "Declan." "Leave it," I said firmly. "We don't need to get involved. Let's just go." She closed the notebook reluctantly and set it back on the ground. Without another word, we turned and headed back to the trail, our pace faster than before. The woods felt different now, darker, closer, as though the trees themselves were leaning in to watch us. And for the first time since we started this hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That first night after finding the abandoned campsite, we set up camp several miles down the trail, hoping to put some distance between us and whatever had spooked its former occupants. Darkness fell quickly, and though the woods were quiet, the memory of the scattered supplies and the eerie journal clung to me like a damp chill. We built a small fire, more out of comfort than necessity, and ate our freeze-dried meals in silence. Harper sat across from me, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow. She was turning her engagement ring absently, her eyes distant. "You okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," she said, but her voice was hollow. She glanced toward the shadows at the edge of the firelight. "Do you think they were just paranoid? The person who wrote in that notebook at the campsite, I mean." I shrugged, not wanting to answer. "Maybe. We didn't see anything. Yet," she said softly, almost to herself. I tossed another stick onto the fire, watching the sparks spiral upward. "Let's just get through tonight. We'll pick up the pace tomorrow." She nodded, though the tension in her posture didn't ease. The forest around us seemed impossibly dark beyond the circle of firelight. The sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch, felt too loud, too deliberate. Every snap made my nerves jolt. Harper eventually retreated to the tent, leaving me to douse the fire and keep watch for a while. I tried to tell myself it was just a precaution, that I wasn't really expecting anything to happen. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard it. A faint rustling sound like dry leaves being brushed aside. At first I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze, gripping the hilt of the machete resting by my side. My eyes darted toward the source of the noise, but all I could see were shifting shadows at the edge of the campsite. "Harper?" I whispered, but the tent was silent. She was asleep. The rustling grew louder, circling the camp. My pulse quickened as I scanned the darkness, straining to make out anything beyond the glow of the embers. Then I heard it. A soft, high-pitched yip. A coyote. Relief flooded me for a brief moment. Just an animal. But the sound was joined by another, then another, until a chorus of yips and howls surrounded us. The coyote's calls were erratic, bouncing from one side of the camp to the other, as though they were moving impossibly fast. My grip on the machete tightened. Something wasn't right. Coyotes were skittish around humans, especially near a fire. But these, they didn't sound scared. If anything, they sounded excited. I sat rigid by the fire pit, every muscle in my body tense, until the calls faded into the distance. Even then, I didn't move, afraid of breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the woods. The next day, Harper and I didn't talk much. We packed up camp at first light and hiked harder than we ever had before, determined to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had been near our camp. But as night fell and we set up camp again, the unease returned. I stayed up late, machete in hand, staring into the darkness. The fire was smaller this time, less inviting, less noticeable. Harper had gone to bed hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. The first sign of trouble came just past midnight. I heard it again, the rustling of leaves, soft but deliberate. This time, I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed the flashlight and machete, scanning the perimeter of the campsite. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating trees, bushes, and nothing else. "Hello?" I called, my voice low but firm. No response. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve in my body on edge. And then I saw it. A glint of movement in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the light. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. The glint vanished. The rustling stopped. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight around the camp, but everything was still. Too still. When I finally returned to the tent, my hands were shaking. By the third night, the visitors were no longer subtle. Harper and I stayed up late together, too anxious to sleep. The fire was out, and the only light came from the lantern we'd hung near the tent. We were talking quietly, trying to distract ourselves, when we heard the first sound. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere just beyond the lantern's glow. Harper grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "That's not a coyote," she whispered. I shook my head, listening as the growl was joined by the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the machete and flashlight. "No, Declan, don't." But I was already stepping into the darkness. The footsteps moved as I did, circling the camp. My flashlight caught glimpses of movement, branches swaying, leaves shifting, but never anything solid. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I turned back toward the tent, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed it. Our food stash, the supply of dehydrated meals and snacks we'd carefully hung from a tree branch to keep away from animals, was gone. The rope dangled loosely, the end frayed as if it had been sliced clean through. I shone the flashlight higher, searching the area around the tree. No food, no wrappers, nothing. "Harper," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. She unzipped the tent and stepped out, clutching the hunting knife. Her eyes darted around the camp. "What is it?" "Our food," I said, gesturing toward the tree. "It's gone. The rope's been cut." Her face paled. "Cut? Are you sure?" I nodded, stepping closer to show her. "See? This wasn't an animal. Someone did this." She stared at the rope, her grip tightening on the knife. "Who? Why?" "I don't know," I said, my voice low. "But they were here, watching us." We spent the rest of the night sitting back to back near the tent, listening for every snap of a twig, every shift of the wind. The forest around us seemed alive with unseen movement, though nothing came close enough to confront us. When dawn broke, we packed up in silence, our minds too heavy with dread to speak. We didn't want to stop that night, but we had no choice. Exhaustion weighed on us like lead, and the small canteen of water we'd salvaged wasn't enough to keep us going. We found a small clearing just off the trail and set up the tent quickly, skipping the fire entirely. As night fell, the unease that had been building all day reached its peak. We sat inside the tent, the hunting knife and machete between us, listening to the distant howls of coyotes. This time, the howls didn't stay distant. The pack drew closer, their cries sharp and erratic, bouncing through the trees. The sound made my skin crawl. It was wrong, like a predator's taunt. Harper grabbed my arm. "They're coming closer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," I said, gripping the machete tightly. The howls stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. And then, we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush just outside the tent. I gestured for Harper to stay quiet and crawled toward the zipper, careful not to make a sound. My heart thundered in my chest as I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. The flashlight's weak beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows. But I knew they were there. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and methodical, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there, wanted us to know we were being watched. "Harper," I whispered, barely audible. "Stay in the tent." Without waiting for her response, I slipped out, machete in one hand, flashlight in the other. The air was thick with tension, every muscle in my body screaming to run. But I couldn't leave her. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at my throat. A flash of movement caught my eye, something darting between the trees. "Show yourself." Silence. And then, a sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter, low and guttural, turning into a high-pitched hyena laugh. It echoed through the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I saw him. A towering figure emerged at the edge of the light, standing at least 6.5 feet tall. Long red hair framed his presence, and he was cloaked in a tattered patchwork of animal hides. His face was concealed by a coyote skull, its hollow eyes catching the beam with an eerie glint. His own eyes shone unnaturally, reflecting the light like an animal's. He stood there for a moment, unmoving, watching me. Then, without a sound, he darted back into the shadows. "Declan!" Harper's voice snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned to run back to the tent, but I wasn't alone. More figures slipped out from the trees, their movements stealthy and predatory. Like the first, they were draped in animal hides, their faces smeared with streaks of mud and ash. Each of them had the same striking red hair, 6 of them in all. I ran, but one of them tackled me from the side. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I hit the ground hard, the machete slipping from my grip. The flashlight shattered as it hit the ground, plunging us into near-total darkness. "Declan!" Harper's scream cut through the chaos. I scrambled to my feet, swinging blindly. The figures retreated into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared, their movements unnervingly smooth. I stumbled back to the tent, bleeding and gasping for air. Harper grabbed me as I fell inside, her face pale with terror. "They're out there," I managed to choke out. She held the knife tightly, her hands trembling. "I know," she whispered. "I heard them." We stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to close our eyes. Every sound outside the tent felt like a threat, every shadow a predator. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, we packed up and moved as quickly as we could. But I knew it wasn't over. They weren't just watching us. They were hunting us, toying with their prey. The morning after the attack felt hollow, as if the forest itself was mourning. The sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, barely touching the ground where Harper and I hurried to pack up what little we had left. My ribs ached from the tackle, and I winced every time I bent down. Harper was quiet, her face pale and drawn, her movements stiff. Neither of us had slept. The memories of last night, the footsteps, the figures, the laughter, clung to us like shadows we couldn't escape. Before we broke camp, I ventured back to the spot where I'd been attacked, hoping to find my machete. My fingers brushed against the shattered remains of my flashlight, but the machete was gone. The realization sent a cold shiver through me. Someone had taken it. When I returned to the camp, Harper was finishing the last of the water from the canteen. Her eyes flicked to me as I approached, reading the tension in my expression. "Anything?" she asked. I shook my head. "Just the flashlight. The machete's gone." Her face tightened. "They took it." "Yeah," I said quietly, the weight of those words sinking in. Whoever they were, they now had the upper hand. We walked in silence, the trail stretching ahead like a never-ending gauntlet. Every sound in the woods made us flinch. The rustle of leaves, the crack of a distant branch, even the whisper of the wind. Harper broke the silence first. "Declan," she said, her voice hesitant. What are they?" I didn't have an answer. "I don't know," I admitted, gripping the strap of my pack tighter. "But they're organized, and they're smart." She nodded but didn't press further. Her eyes stayed fixed on the trail, scanning every inch of it as if expecting another ambush. We stopped briefly for water near a stream. The cold liquid was a relief, but it did little to calm the unease that gnawed at my gut. As I filled the small canteen, my mind drifted to Annie and John. Their faces had been etched with fear. I remembered the way John had been so adamant, so desperate to get away, and the way Annie had looked at Harper before they left. That's when it hit me. I froze, the realization spreading through me like ice. "What's wrong?" Harper asked, crouching beside me. I looked at her, my throat dry. "Annie and John." Her brow furrowed. "What about them?" "They knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Knew what?" "They knew about this," I said, gesturing to the woods around us. "About them." Harper blinked, clearly confused. "How could they have known?" "They were acting strange from the start," I said, my thoughts racing. "They were nervous, jumpy. They were running from something, Harper, and they didn't warn us." Her face paled. "You think they ran into them?" I nodded. "They must have. Why else would they cut their hike short? Why else would they act like that?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "But why wouldn't they tell us? Why wouldn't they warn us about what was out here?" I hesitated, the answer burning in my chest. "Because," I said slowly, "if they told us, they would have kept the attention on themselves. They needed a distraction, someone to draw the focus away from them." Her eyes widened in horror. "They used us," she said, the words trembling as they left her lips. I nodded grimly. "They saw an opportunity, and they took it. They let us walk right into it so they could get away." Harper stood abruptly, her breathing quick and shallow. She paced a few steps, then stopped, her hands clenched into fists. That's disgusting. How could they do that to us? To anyone?" "Fear makes people do desperate things," I said, my voice edged with bitterness despite my effort to sound understanding. "Especially when they're afraid for their lives." She shook her head, her expression twisting in anger. "They could have warned us. They could have given us a chance to prepare." "They didn't care," I said simply. The weight of it settled between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to be angry too, but there wasn't room for it. All I felt was a cold, hollow acceptance. "They're gone now," I said after a long silence. "And we're still here. That's all that matters." Harper's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. She knelt by the stream, cupping her hands to splash water on her face. When she looked at me again, her eyes were sharp, determined. "We can't stop," she said. "We have to keep moving. If we're going to make it to that pit stop, we can't waste time thinking about them. They're not our problem anymore." I nodded, though her words didn't ease the ache in my chest. The truth was, Annie and John weren't just gone. They'd left us to face this nightmare alone. And now, we had no choice but to survive it. The days after our realization about Annie and John passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Each night brought a new attack, and each morning left us more battered and desperate. The savages didn't seem to tire, didn't seem to falter. They were always just out of sight, watching, waiting. Sometimes they'd leave marks on the trail ahead, strange symbols carved into trees or piles of stones arranged in unsettling patterns. Other times, they'd leave us offerings of twisted animal remains, fresh and glistening with blood. Harper and I tried to avoid them, but there was no escaping their hunt. They didn't just want to terrify us. They wanted to break us. One night, as we tried to rest in a shallow hollow, exhaustion finally caught up to us. We couldn't even speak, our bodies trembling from exertion and dehydration. Harper leaned against me, her grip on the hunting knife slack. That's when they came. It started with the coyotes again, their eerie howls weaving through the forest. But this time, we didn't need to wonder. We knew those cries weren't from animals. The sound came closer, and then the first savage burst through the trees, his animal hide clothing blending into the shadows. He lunged for Harper, his hands outstretched. "Harper!" I shouted, springing to my feet with what little strength I had left. She moved faster than I thought possible, slashing upward with the hunting knife. The blade caught the man across the chest, and he let out a guttural scream as he fell back, clutching the wound. Blood poured between his fingers, staining the ground beneath him. Another figure charged in from the right, aiming straight for me. I swung my broken flashlight, striking him across the face. He staggered but didn't fall. Before I could react, a third man tackled me to the ground, his weight crushing the air from my lungs. "Harper!" I gasped, struggling beneath the man's grip. I heard her scream, a sound that cut through the chaos like a blade. She fought off another attacker, the knife flashing in her hand. Her blade sank deep into his thigh, and he crumpled to the ground, howling in pain. The remaining figures retreated into the woods, dragging their wounded with them. But it was obvious. Lines had been crossed, and things could only get worse from here on out. By morning, we knew we couldn't stop again. The savages were relentless, and we had no supplies left. No food, no water, no strength. "We run," Harper said, her voice hoarse but resolute. "We run until we find help or die trying." I nodded. There was no other choice. We moved as fast as we could, our feet pounding the trail, our lungs burning with every breath. The coyotes followed, their cries echoing around us like a twisted chorus. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a signal, guiding the savages to our location. "Harper," I panted, "they're using the howls to communicate." "I know," she said, her voice tight. "We just have to keep moving." But no matter how fast we ran, the howls never faded. It happened just before dusk. We'd pushed ourselves to the brink, our bodies on the verge of collapse. The forest closed in around us, the trees casting long, eerie shadows across the trail. The howls abruptly ceased, leaving an unsettling silence. A loud hoot from a nearby owl broke the stillness, a call eerily familiar. It was the same owl we'd heard that day with John and Annie, the one that had sent them fleeing in fear. We froze, the sudden recognition more terrifying than any noise. "They're here," Harper whispered, clutching the knife tightly. I didn't have time to respond. The first figure appeared ahead of us, blocking the trail. Then another stepped out from the trees to our left, and another to our right. They surrounded us, their numbers even larger than we'd feared. "Harper," I said, my voice shaking. "Run." "No," she said firmly, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Run," I shouted, stepping forward to put myself between her and the advancing savages. The first one lunged at me, and I swung the broken flashlight, catching him across the jaw. But two others grabbed me from behind, dragging me to the ground. "Harper, go!" I screamed as they pinned me, their hands like iron. I saw her hesitate, her eyes meeting mine. Then, with a sob, she turned and ran. The savages didn't chase her. They stayed focused on me. One of them, the tallest, raised a massive branch high above his head, aiming for my skull. The branch came down, but before it could strike, Harper was there. She lunged from the trees, the hunting knife flashing in her hand. The blade sank deep into the tall man's neck and he let out a strangled cry, dropping the branch, crumpling to the ground, never to get up again. The others turned on her, their movements like a pack of wolves closing in. One grabbed her, slamming her to the ground. Another wrapped his hands around my throat, choking the life out of me. I struggled, gasping for air, my vision narrowing. The last thing I saw was Harper fighting, her screams echoing through the trees. Then everything went black. When I woke, the forest was silent. I lay on the ground, my body aching, my throat raw. Blood stained the dirt around me, but the savages were gone. "Harper!" I called, my voice cracking. There was no answer. I forced myself to my feet, every step agony. My legs trembled as I staggered through the woods, shouting her name over and over. Then I heard it. Faint, distant, a single cry for help. "Harper!" I screamed, running toward the sound. But as I neared, the cries stopped. I stumbled through the woods for hours, my mind frantic, my body on the verge of collapse. Day turned to night, and still I searched, shouting until my voice gave out. I found the campers the next day, a group of 4 sitting around a fire. They stared at me in shock as I stumbled into their camp, bloody and disheveled. "Help!" My voice strained. "Please, my fiancée, she's missing." They called for help, and the authorities arrived within hours. I told them everything, every horrifying detail. The search lasted 4 days. On the 4th day, they found it. A tree, deep in the woods, with a machete buried into its trunk. Tied to the handle was Harper's engagement ring, the inscription glinting in the sunlight. "On our trail forever." But there was no sign of her. There never would be. After another 4 days, the authorities called off the search. I remained and continued searching with help of dozens of volunteers, along with her parents, family, and friends. In mid-December, we were forced to call off our search due to the snow and extreme cold weather. A year has passed, but time hasn't dulled the sharp edges of my grief. The world has moved on, but I'm still haunted by the events on the trail, replaying every decision, every scream, wondering if I could have changed the outcome. Harper is gone, and with her went the life we were supposed to have. The wilderness, once our sanctuary, has become a graveyard of memories, a place that took everything and left nothing but guilt and unanswered questions. I tried to move forward, but it feels like walking through a fog. I see her everywhere, in the tilt of a stranger's head, in a laugh that echoes hers, and each time, hope flickers before reality snuffs it out. The ring I gave her, the one inscribed with "On our trail forever," now hangs around my neck, a cruel reminder of promises that can never be fulfilled. Some days, I convince myself she's still out there, wandering, trying to find her way back to me. But deep down, I know the forest, those savages, they took her, leaving nothing but guilt and a hollow ache where our life together should have been. Sometimes I have dreams where we're walking hand in hand, only to wake up to the cold weight of the ring around my neck. If we'd celebrated our anniversary any other way, she'd still be here. That thought haunts me most. I promised we'd be on our trail forever, but now I walk it alone, carrying the burden of what I couldn't save and what I can never forget.